So this is Madhuri Ramesh, my guest today. She started her career as a biologist, studying Travancore tortoises in the Western Ghats and then spiny-tailed lizards in Rajasthan. And then she jumped into political ecology, studying sea turtle conservation in Orissa. Welcome to Wild Women Interviews, Madhuri.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
If you could change one thing about yourself, what would it be?
Hmm. Yes, that's the tough questions. Does it have to be a very serious thing? Because actually, what I would really like to change is the tip of my nose. I love the way it wiggles in some animals, and I've always thought that'll be such a cool feature to have.
Just the nose, why not the ears also?
No, I mean, the nose is more subtle. Flapping your ears is very obvious.
Not flapping, I mean, but you know how dogs do that?
Twitching?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like
Yeah.
facing it forward,
Mm.
sideways, back.
Yeah, now maybe I should lengthen my list. But I've always envied the way that just the tip of their nose scans the surroundings. It's just amazing. Yeah.
And but tortoises and lizards don't do that.
Nah, they don't. They don't.
Okay, so who or what would you like to be reincarnated as?
An armadillo.
Okay. Which historical figure do you identify with?
The common man in those R.K. Lakshman cartoons, it just really resonates with me. He's always standing in the thick of things and wondering what is going on around him. And you can just see that whole, confusion and curiosity on his face. And that's something I can really relate to.
Okay. So you started out as a biologist and then you jumped into political ecology. What made you switch careers like that?
Hmm. Yeah, well, jump sounds like a very decisive, quick thing to do, but actually, it was more like being nudged, uh, for quite a long period of time by various people, by various experiences. Because what happened was when I started doing field biology, I actually I was pretty naive in the sense I just swallowed whole whatever you are told in conservation biology, which is that there are all these pristine places and species and things like that. So I was rather taken by surprise when I found how many people lived in these landscapes and how well they knew these landscapes. So that was a huge eye opener for me. And the people I worked with also were very willing to share their take on a lot of things, including conservation. So with time, I felt I was missing a lot of the story. I was just missing a large part of the story about what's going on in these kinds of places, and what really shapes conservation. It was much more than the kind of data collection I was doing or the kind of training I had. So I really felt like I wanted to pay serious attention to the human dimensions of these things. And that's why I moved to studying political ecology. But it took a long time. Like I said.
How did you even know there was such a thing called political ecology?
Yeah. Well, actually, after my master's, I worked here and there for a long time. There's almost, I think, 8 to 10 years gap between my master's and my PhD. And in all of that working here and there, I heard about anthropology and the kind of insights it can give you. And then I was talking to a friend and saying, I have all these heretical questions almost about conservation and what it does to people in these sorts of landscapes. And he said, oh, wait, there's a whole discipline that's devoted to these things, and you're not the only one who has these doubts. You must read in this subject called political ecology. So that's how I realized I'm not nuts, and there are other people asking very similar questions.
So you worked in the Western Ghats, then you went to Rajasthan. But when you decided to do political ecology, you moved to Orissa. Why not? Why didn't you think of working in areas you were already familiar with?
Yeah. Well, actually, between Rajasthan and Orissa, I also worked in Nagaland and Pondicherry and a bunch of other places. Yeah, just been sort of hanging around on the fringes of the country. But I chose Orissa because it had a lot of ecological material available already. There had been a long term monitoring study on sea turtles there, and there was a lot of politics around sea turtle conservation. And well, I was familiar with marine turtles because I used to be part of the SSTCN in Chennai when I was a student. So that was a familiar species. I was familiar with the people, with the biologists at least, who worked on sea turtles in Orissa. And they were very approachable, very encouraging of this kind of questioning and interest. So I thought it would be a good chance to, go to a new landscape, but not an entirely alien landscape at the same time. You know?
So, give me some sense of background of your study site in Orissa.
Yeah, so there are two of these really important mass nesting sites for olive ridleys in Orissa. One is Rushikulya, which is in southern Orissa, and the other is Gahirmatha, which is a little further up north. Gahirmatha is what most people know because that's a marine sanctuary, and a lot of the early wildlife films were all shot there. Rushikulya is very different from the normal expectations you have of a sort of global conservation hotspot or anything, because it's a small stretch of beach which is lined by a bunch of fishing villages, and lots of people come and go on those beaches. And then you also have these thousands of turtles that just land up sometime between February and March to nest. So it's an amazingly inhabited, busy landscape that also has this mind-blowing number of turtles using the same space. Gahirmatha is much more traditional in the sense it's a protected area, and it's very difficult to access and all of those things. But these were my two sort of focal areas of interest. But my actual fieldwork involved my zigzagging around quite a lot of other places in Bhubaneswar, because I used something called multi-sited ethnography, which meant that I, observed what was happening and spoke to people in various locations, not just in these two places. But the common thread or the common logic for selecting those people and places was that they were all connected to marine turtle conservation in some way. So, it could be the forest department officials in Bhubaneswar, or the fisheries people in Cuttack, or some activist who was actually based in Kendrapada. And I would track those connections to see what was happening under this umbrella of conservation.
But both the sites had a pretty different history of conservation, right? Like you mentioned, one is a protected area and the other is just bustling with people. But the nature of politics is also different because of that history.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, well, it's a bit of both, right? The history makes the politics and the other way around. Um, and by politics, I really mean the sort of power dynamics in all these places, not the formal politics. Um, yeah, they're very different because the reasons for keeping one marine sanctuary and keeping the other as it is, as a sort of public beach, were very different, and some you know, and that was in response to a lot of things on the ground, to a lot of conditions that had changed on the ground. So the time that Gahirmatha had been identified as a mass nesting site was in the 70s, And that's when we saw a lot of, both government and non-governmental interest in creating protected areas, right? So it was, from that time, there were people sort of pushing for a sanctuary status, and then it kind of dragged on, and it wasn't resolved until the 1990s. It dragged on because it's also a very important place for fisheries, for trawl fisheries, and that's a booming and significant industry in Orissa. But in the 1990s, there was a controversy at the WTO because the Americans market banned importing shrimp from India. And they said that ban was because of environmental concerns, that a lot of turtles were dying as bycatch. So there are various theories as to, how serious an environmental concern it was, or whether it was just the US trying to protect its own markets because its shrimp fleet was not doing very well at that time. So there were all of these discussions going on. But when India sort of lodged a complaint at the WTO and said this kind of a ban violates the terms of free trade and it can't be imposed like this unilaterally, the WTO asked India to sort of demonstrate how it was looking after its turtles. And as part of that, needing to show its environmental concern, the sanctuary was created in Gahirmatha. But at the same time, like with any other sanctuary creation process, there was a lot of protests on the ground, and the way the rules were implemented, the trawl fishing still kind of went on the way it did, and then the other artisanal fishers were very badly hit by the restrictions. And so there was also a lot of unevenness in how it played out. And all of it generated this huge public sort of image of conservationists as people who didn't care about fisher folk, who didn't understand the dynamics or difficulties of fishing, and who were very sort of you know, um, tunnel visioned about how they did things. So there was a lot of flack, and there was even like overt confrontations between the forest department and the fishing people and things. So it was just a big mess. And as a result of that, both the government and the sort of biologists and other kinds of NGO people were very taken aback by the impact that the sanctuary had on people, and they did a serious rethink about how they would want to proceed in the case of Rushikulya. Rushikulya anyway was sort of identified as a mass nesting sanctuary only much later, only in the 1990s, when Bibash Pandav went on his survey. So it also came at a later time period when people were more concerned about multi-dimensional impacts of conservation. So when they found that Rushikulya was a very important site, by the 1990s, people were much more savvy about how conservation had to have local support, and you had to spend some time convincing communities. You couldn't just slap bans on what they did. And therefore, Rushikulya, got some level of endorsement even from, say, the forest department. And they tried to. There was a UNDP project that funded a lot of training of people. So a whole bunch of local NGOs, came into being at that point. They all got training in turtle monitoring, in maintaining hatcheries. So there was incredible interest, even at the ground level at that point. And and that's how Rushikulya kind of ended up continuing to be a non-sanctuary area, and it seems to be doing just fine.
The history of sea turtle conservation in Gahirmatha didn't negatively impact it in Rushikulya, right? Like people they didn't see sea turtles as a cause for their loss of livelihood, or do they fear that protected area might be slapped on them like it had happened in Gahir Mata? I'm asking if Gahir Mata is like put the fear of the forest department or conservation in the minds of people in Rushikulya?
To be fair, people fear conservation and sanctuaries all over the country because it means, humongous restrictions. Our laws are very draconian once you have a formal protected area. So it's not just Orissa Forest Department or Gahirmatha per se. It's just generally, I think, anywhere in the country, people are very worried if you say you're going to declare a sanctuary in their backyards. But the difference also was that, there were a whole bunch of people working in Rushikulya who had really good relations with the communities. I mean, starting with Bivash himself, the number of people I met, and I'm going, what, some almost 20 years after Bivash was in that landscape. And the number of guys I met who said, "Oh, we were young boys then, but this Bivash used to come and explain to us, and he used to, talk to us so nicely. He would tell us what's special about these turtles, so we all got interested." So I think Rushikulya, it just happened that there were a bunch of people who were willing to spend time talking and not just sort of coming and bossing over everybody else. And that really helped set the tone and, take it in a different direction. And then you also had a lot of people from Dakshin Foundation, especially Aarti Sridhar, who spent a lot of time documenting the fishing community's difficulties and, writing about their perspective on conservation and why they had such ambivalent feelings towards it, and what the real losses to them was because of overly sort of strict rules. And I think a lot of that really helped because then people stopped seeing it in entirely kind of black and white terms. They realized there is a larger issue of pollution and degradation of resources, and that's sort of affecting everyone across the board. That it's not only about fisheries or only about turtles, but just about the state of the marine ecosystem. And I think some of those things really help.
So, as you mentioned, been a long history of research in this area. So, people are very, very tuned into what research is, how researchers behave. So, did you find that helped the way your research work, or did you have to explain? Like, I remember going to places where people didn't know what research was. Why would you want to do research? For how is it helpful to anybody or anything? And you had to really go down to the basics. But in a place like this where people would have been savvy about research, did it help your research work?
It was interesting. Well, actually, I want to say one thing first. When people ask these kinds of questions, I actually have an existential crisis every time. I'm not very sure how to answer this thing of why are you doing research or why on this particular thing. The truth is, a lot of my decisions are fairly irrational ones. I study an animal because I like it or something like that. I don't really have a great reason, the way they're expecting. But this was a very different and interesting experience compared to the other places I had worked in because, yeah, like I mentioned, people were very savvy. There had been almost some 10 years of monitoring by people at ISC. Karthik Shankar's group had been monitoring turtles and also training some of the NGO people in those techniques. So when I went, people already knew a lot of turtle biology. They knew a lot of the technical terms. They knew what flipper tags were for. They could tell you the difference between sporadic and mass nesting, all kinds of things. So that was fascinating for me to interact with a community that was so tuned in and up to date on biology. And they would just rattle off names of researchers, that I've worked with so and so, I've met so and so. This person came to the beach that day to take photographs, but the turtles didn't come. So they had like a dossier on everyone who had been there. That was very interesting. But it could also get really difficult because with that experience came a set of expectations about how researchers should behave. I mean, it's a performance in a way, right? When you do research. And they were finding that I wasn't doing the actions that most researchers do. Like, for instance, a lot of my work was ethnographic. right? So I would just take freewheeling notes when people were talking to me. Sometimes I had a recorder on, but a lot of times I didn't. And people would come and ask me, आप सिर्फ ऐसे बात करके आपका काम हो जाएगा? I mean, like, why are you chatting like this? And then a few people even asked me specifically, आपके पास ये फॉर्म नहीं है जो टिक टिक करने के लिए, because they were so used to filling survey sheets or watching somebody else fill survey sheets, so just they just felt quite dissatisfied that I seemed to be doing this whatever bohemian nonsense of just hanging about and sometimes writing notes and sometimes not even that. So it was a bit hard to get people to believe that I'm there to really do research, and that was tough. And this wasn't just the communities. I mean, even a lot of the officials didn't seem very aware of anthropology or other methods of study. First of all, I had a very hard time convincing forest department I don't want to count turtles. It just seemed to defy all expectations that you would come to an Aribada site, have a master's in ecology, and still say you don't want to count turtles. And therefore, I didn't apply for permits. And the in-house scientist kept calling me up to ask, "Are you sure?" And maybe he thought I was counting them on the sly. I was like, "No, no. The only time I go to the beach is to talk to people. I'm not actually doing anything on the turtles." Yeah, so um, it was both interesting and a bit challenging to navigate these kinds of expectations that people have.
So,
Yeah,
what was the most surprising thing that you learned?
that discussing when the Aribara will happen is a form of small talk. It's amazing. Like almost every person I met would ask me something like, "So when do you think the Aribara will happen?" And I would be rather boring and say, "Oh, it's hard to say. Maybe between Feb and March is when it happens." And they said, "No, no, no. I will tell you. I have a system for calculating it, and they will explain a lot of things to you, and then tell you when they think it would happen." And it was amazing the number of people who were so into this Aribada small talk thing that I wrote a section about it in my thesis because I thought this is amazing. I mean, here is an animal that has totally captured people's imagination to the point that this serves as an ice-breaking conversation. And people will use terms like Aribada and sporadic nesting and migration and all of these things. It's amazing. I've not seen this kind of scientific jargon, permeate small talk in any other landscape that I've worked in. That was, yeah, amazing.
So, based on all the stuff you discovered, like about how declaring a protected area in Gahirmatha might have worked against turtles, and how a more inclusive form of conservation in Rushikulya might be the way to go. Do you think that is a role model for how we should practice conservation?
I'm very uncomfortable with sort of saying something should be the model for conservation because I think a lot depends on the species. The reason Gahirmatha is not working the way it was supposed to is because, apart from the social conflict, which is considerable, is the fact that turtles are so mobile. I mean, you're talking about animals that can swim across ocean basins, and today we have people talking about buying real estate on the moon, but we still don't quite know where these turtles go or how far they travel or anything of that kind, right? So that's the kind of lack of information that we're dealing with. And to think we can sort of draw a square in the water and expect an animal like that to stay in it just seems bizarre. So that's one of the biggest reasons that I feel conservation has to be in response to that species and also in response to a particular locality. The other reason that this sort of informal arrangement has worked in Rushikulya is also because the nature of fishing in Rushikulya is itself very different. It's quite small scale that they use nets which the turtles just tear through. So it's that entire coastal shelf is very different in nature and supports a different set of fish and fisheries as compared to Gahirmatha. So a lot of these are really because of the particular context in which that model is located, that it works or it doesn't work. And I think it would be a bit weird for me to say this is how it should be everywhere.
So one of the different things that's different about the Orissa coast is not only do you have the regular lineup of forest department, local communities, conservationists, but you also have international conservation organizations coming in. So how did their involvement change the dynamics of conservation, the way it's practiced?
Yeah, well, you had some of these big international organizations come in, but that this was again in the 1990s when the Gahirmatha crisis and controversy was sort of at its peak, and a lot has been written about it. So, for instance, the IUCN was consulted because somebody was planning to build a port near Gahirmatha, and they hired the IUCN as consultants to ask what they could do to mitigate harm to turtles. And though the IUCN is the same body that puts out red lists and has listed the olive ridleys as a vulnerable species and knows better than anybody else how far these animals travel, they decided that you could build something outside the port, marine sanctuary. You could have a port, you could have dredging, you could have all of those things, and it would just be fine. It just made no sense at all for them to take that stance, but they did. And they did it in spite of the Indian representatives of the Marine Turtle Specialist Group objecting. So, international involvement has been strange to say the least. And it's definitely not been responsive to local concerns or, you know, or I feel there was not even a serious attempt to understand what was happening on the ground. And a lot of it has been documented formally as well. But yeah, so I don't think international involvement particularly added anything constructive to ideas of conservation or social justice. I don't think it contributed much.
Do you miss going back to doing simple old biological studies?
No, I don't think so. I think those simple studies were also rather blind studies, to be honest. I was just missing the woods for the trees all the time. It was very dissatisfying. I would constantly have my field assistants like ticking me off on various things and saying, "आप लोग ऐसे किए हैं और आप लोगों ने ये rule बनाया." And I never. It took me a long time to really figure out where that was coming from and why conservation is a very problematic thing to engage in. You really can't afford to be, I think, complacent and take this moral high ground and say, I'm saving species that nobody else cares about. I think there's a lot more thorny issues involved in doing conservation.
Thank you so much, Madhuri. That was really fun and enlightening to talk to you about
Sure.
this.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.